take a seat, please. Okay, brilliant. Thank you ever so much for coming to join us. I appreciate this is quite a noisy experience for everybody involved. So I'm here to give you an extremely warm, literally and metaphorically, welcome to this discussion on the role of creative policy making in achieving the complete energy transition to net zero. So my name's Rachel McEwen and my day job is Chief Sustainability Officer of UK-based energy company SSE. We're a generator of electricity and we operate networks in different parts of the United Kingdom. Now, describe us as being on the front line and a very practical example of a company undertaking an almighty transition from one that had enormous amount of carbon dioxide being emitted to one that's 3/4 of our way through the journey to net zero. But we've still got some really tricky and serious heavy lifting still to do. But my job this afternoon is a bit more simple, and it's just to take you through and guide you a discussion with 4 superbly authoritative leaders in that said transition. So, our 4 guests are the Right Honourable Ed Miliband. Ed is a Member of Parliament for Doncaster North and is Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Net Zero in the United Kingdom. We've got Adair Turner, who is Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission. The ETC has only been around 7 years, but it has a voice that's making an enormous impact, not least because of the focus on facts and not just arguments. Then at the end, we've got Giles Dixon, who is Chief Executive of Wind Europe, the trade body that gives voice to the multitude of renewables developers and operators that are out there in Europe. In fact, there's hundreds of them. And finally, next to me here, we have SSE's very own Martin Pibworth. Martin is our Chief Commercial Officer and brings with him a serious amount of practical experience, real-world experience of bringing about this revolution in the power section. So, the plan is that each panellist will make an opening gambit, probably about 4 or 5 minutes, and then I'm going to follow up with a couple of extra questions. Then I'm very keen to get questions from the floor too. Success will be measured in part by us achieving all of those things in the next 55 minutes. So let me start with Ed, as I can sort of see you down there. So Ed, there are 2 things that I am enormously thankful for. The first is the Paris Agreement, and the second is the UK's groundbreaking Climate Change Act. You can take an enormous amount of personal credit for that Act of Parliament, so I do think it's worth reflecting for a moment on that. But actually, more importantly, we're really interested if you can spell out the kinds of things that a potential future Labour government would be doing next.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much, and it's great to be on this panel, and I want to really thank SSE for the amazing work that you do. I mean, look, what do I observe? I want to start with the context of COP. What do I observe? That many countries, many companies are doing a lot to drive this transition forward in a way that is frankly transformed from where we were a decade ago. But we all know that we are going too slowly, and we know what the science, in a way it's easy to lose sight of what the science actually tells us. The science tells us we've got to have a 42% reduction in emissions by 2030 as a world if we're going to stay on track for 1.5 degrees or have any chance of meeting 1.5 degrees, and at the moment emissions are rising. I hope that if a Labour government is elected next year, we can show the kind of global leadership that frankly Britain has shown over the years but hasn't been showing in the last few years, and certainly not in the last few months, And for me, this always begins with the power of our example. Because if you want to negotiate with credibility on the international stage, you have to start off with the fact that you are doing the right thing at home. And that's why if we come into government, we will drive towards a zero carbon power system by 2030, and we'll be the first major country in the world to do that, doubling onshore wind, trebling solar, quadrupling offshore wind. We will not issue new oil and gas licenses because that is what the science tells us, and indeed what Adair's excellent Energy Transitions Commission report on fossil fuels published a couple of weeks ago tells us, and I urge you all to read it. We will have 1.5 degree transition plans on a mandatory basis for all major companies and financial institutions, because again, that is part of complying with the science, and we will play our part in MDB reform as an essential component of getting the finance that developing countries need. Now, that is in a sense what we will do, but I think there's a really important argument about why we will do it. We will do it because it's the right thing to do for climate action, but we will also do it because it's the right thing domestically. And I think this is where the case is even clearer than it was a decade or so ago when I was the Climate Change Secretary. We know that if we drive further and faster for green energy in the UK, and SSE are doing this, it will lower bills, it won't raise them. We know it will give us more energy security, not less, because the reason we've had the worst cost of living crisis in memory is because we are so exposed and dependent on fossil fuels, not Russian fossil fuels, that's only 5%, but the fossil fuel markets in general. We know that this is the biggest industrial opportunity of this century and indeed for generations. We know the IEA say there will be 17 million jobs created net in the green economy by 2030, and we know it's part of climate action. And what we want to be is a government that will work with businesses like SSE, with the public investment, with the sense of mission, to make sure that Britain benefits from that transition and the world benefits from British leadership.
Fantastic. Bang on time. Brilliant. So, Lord Turner, can I come to you? Adair, you bring a very global helicopter view, which I think is quite useful. Can you give us a sense of what the big developments in public policy are elsewhere, and how do you think that's affecting the world that we're in?
Well, although I'm going to take a global view, let me start with something that Ed said, getting to a zero carbon electricity system by 2030. Because there's lots of things we need to do to build a zero carbon global economy. We need sustainable aviation fuels. We need to switch out marine fuel to ammonia or methanol for shipping. We need to decarbonize steel production, probably with the use of hydrogen. But the single most important thing we need to do is electrify, 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 and decarbonize the electricity system. At the ETC, we think that if we're to have a zero carbon economy, we have to go from electricity accounting for about 20% of final energy demand across the world today to as much as 65% by 2050. But that's not the stop of it, because beyond that, electricity will also be used to produce green hydrogen, and that could be another 10% of final energy demand. And even where we have some carbon-based fuels, such as methanol, there will be electricity going into the hydrogen to make the methanol. So you cannot understate the importance of the electricity system, and you cannot understate the importance of the rich, developed world getting to net zero electricity systems, and as a result, being able to say in the emerging markets, this is possible. I spent a lot of my time in China. As you probably know, they are rolling out renewables faster than anybody else in the world. They will install over 200 gigawatts of solar this year. But in China, I am still met by people who say, but alongside that solar, of course we'll have to build some more coal because we need to balance the system because the sun doesn't shine all of the time. So I don't think we should underestimate the importance in the West of getting definitively to net zero electricity systems across Europe, and I hope across America as well, and saying, look, this is how you balance zero carbon electricity systems. It's possible. Now, within that, I'm not going to say it's the easy bit, but it's the easier bit, is the generation side. Right? We know that the cheapest way to produce electricity in general across the world is solar PV, certainly in the equatorial sunny areas where the vast majority of the world's population live, rather than in the colder, less sunny northern climes. And wind, although it's had a few setbacks over the last few years, we think is also on a relentless path of getting cheaper and cheaper. The cheapest way to produce kilowatt hours of electricity is to go renewables. All the really interesting challenges in the long term on the electricity system is not how we generate electricity, but how we balance supply and demand throughout the year. What do we do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? And the answer has a lot to do with grids. It has grid interconnectivity, connecting faraway sources of renewable electricity to centres of demand nationally and internationally. It means developing time of day prices that enable us to do demand management. It means developing new forms of storage, whether they be lithium ion or pumped hydro or hydrogen as well. So at the ETC this year, thank you very much for your plug for our report on fossil fuels. One of our flagship reports is going to be on everything to do with the development of grids to make sure that we don't have grid supply chain blockages to connecting renewables, everything to do with storage, and everything to do with balancing supply and demand throughout the year and throughout the day. And that is also what a lot of our focus is on in the work we are doing in India and in China, and we also hope to be doing in Indonesia this year. So it's great that you have that target, Ed, and I think it is achievable, and I think if we get to that, and when we get to that, let's put it this way, that will be a beacon of example to the whole world.
Thank you very much, Adair. So I'm now going to turn to Giles. Giles, Wind Europe is describing the European wind power package as a game changer. And the Green Deal industrial plan, I guess, is Europe's response to the American Inflation Reduction Act. Can you talk us through the consequences of these policies, reflecting on what's creative, because that's the theme of today's session, but also give a little bit of insight as to what that might mean for wind development everywhere else too? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Everything that Ed and Adair you've said is spot on. Adair, great what you said about grids and system integration. That is becoming the big bottleneck to the build-out of renewables. It used to be permitting, but now governments are changing the permitting rules and procedures. In the European Union, there's a new concept of the build-out of wind and solar being a matter of overriding public interest, so the judges have to take that into account when people are challenging the permits that have been given. And we're now winning court cases we used to be losing, and the permitting volumes are doubling in France and Germany on the back of that. Good. We have a bottleneck with grids. Innovative policy solutions. Spain are doing something quite smart. They're closing down their coal-fired power stations and they are auctioning the grid capacity. A consortia are gathering and bidding for the grid connection that used to serve the coal-fired power station. And the more creative you are, the more hydrogen and batteries that's in your offering, the more likely you are to win. Fine. But then there's another issue. Almost an elephant in the room, that we won't actually deliver on any of this if we don't have companies and factories that can build the kit. And if you look across the whole of the clean energy piece, we don't make much solar PV in Europe. We're trying to make some batteries, but we're way behind the Chinese. We're not really making many electrolyzers. The Chinese dominate. Wind is one of the few industries that is still largely made in Europe. And of course, we say Europe in the widest possible geographical sense, here. But that supply chain for wind is under threat now from Chinese wind turbine manufacturers who are offering turbines in Europe at prices that are 50% below the European prices, and with financing terms that say, Ed, I'll sell you a wind turbine, I'll deliver it to you within 10 months, and you don't have to pay me for 3 years. Deferred payment sounds very attractive to you. Now, a European manufacturer doesn't have the financial muscle to offer you that. And because we're headquartered in OECD countries, OECD rules apply, we are not allowed to offer you deferred payment. Chinese can, because the Chinese state financial institutions are covering the cash flow. And they offer lower prices, because again, the Chinese competition is unfairly subsidized. And European governments have to act against this. And this is what the wind power package from the European Union is all about. We're extremely worried, Ed, that the present UK government is talking to Mingyang about the possibility of their building a factory in the UK. We're not sure that this is in the UK's national interest at all. We've just got out of one energy dependency on Russian gas. Don't increase our dependency on Chinese renewable energy equipment. We're taking over 2% of Europe's land space, 3% of Europe's sea space with wind turbines. Our citizens expect the economic benefits to be staying at home, not going to the other side of the world. And then, of course, there are the national security considerations around the sensors on the turbines, the data that needs to stay in Europe.
Thank you very much, Giles. Now, our last opening gambit from Martin. SSE is just one company, one developer, but I do think real-world practical experience is a very powerful perspective. And what you've seen personally over the last decade or so, what's worked and what should happen next?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to be on this panel. I think the key to all of this and unlocking big renewable investments and net zero economies is policy. So we've already referenced the Climate Change Act. That has been followed by a succession of progressive policies, including EMR. And the importance of some of those policies has not only been the initial intent of the policy, but also the ability for policymakers to pragmatically flex those policies when events occur. And that has enabled investors like SSE to embark on quite big, slightly risky, large capital projects, probably doing things that we didn't even imagine would be in our portfolio even 10 years ago, and launching on investment programs on the assumption that the policies are stable, they are bankable, and they will adjust as events take their inevitable turn. That has undoubtedly unlocked offshore wind. We were at an event a couple of weeks ago, Ed, and I referenced that we opened Beatrice offshore wind farm off the top of Scotland, off a place called Wick, in about 4 or 5 years ago. We opened that. It had 7 megawatt offshore turbines at the time, largest in Europe, being installed 3 months later. Because of policy and policy belief and assumptions that policy were going to stay, innovation, technology take over, and we bid Dogger Bank wind farm on the assumption we're going to put turbines there at twice the size, and those are the ones being installed right now today. So good policy unlocks innovation and unlocks technology. I'm struck by Adair's comments. I really agree with you, Adair. Back in COP26, we commissioned a report by LCP where we talked about what is needed to unlock net zero. The answer is pretty straightforward from LCP. They said go really large on renewables, go really large on flexible technologies, go large on transmission, and make sure your distribution networks are greening themselves. I would say on one of those, we've had really good progress offshore wind. Transmission, we've seen a change in the UK to maybe a more strategic approach, which is going to unlock more offshore wind. The thing that's perhaps slightly disappointing in terms of pace is some of those flexible technologies. I'll give you just one insight into what we're doing as a company today. Today, it seems incredible to believe while we're basking in 28-degree heat, Scotland today is -2. There is not much wind in Scotland today. It is very, very cold, and demand is very high in the UK. We are not exporting, to our regret, much offshore wind power onto the grid. What we have on instead is we have Peterhead on, 1,100 megawatts gas station. We have Medway, 740 megawatts in Kent. We have Keadby 1 and Keadby 2, 1,500 megawatts in Lincolnshire. We have Marchwood, 840 megawatts of gas-fired power station down on the south coast. And all of those things are filling in the gap that you eloquently describe, Adair. We want all of those stations to be decarbonised. We would like to see carbon capture. We would like to see hydrogen blending. And frankly, we want to do that by 2030. And we're hopeful that we can get some kind of policy momentum on this so we can start deploying our capital there and make sure that when the wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine, we can fill it in with decarbonised electricity.
Great, fantastic set of openers. Thank you very much. We have got so little time and an awful lot to do. So what I would like to do is I want to pick up on 3 themes, if that's okay, on speed and urgency, on industrial impacts, and also on social interdependencies. And what I'm going to suggest is that we do this in pairs, because we'll never get through them all if we do all 4 of you at once. So, on speed and urgency, can I suggest we go Adair, then Martin? And I'm picking up on that elephant in the room, which is that we are not going fast enough. And I mean we in the most inclusive sense possible. And I'm loving all the commitments that have been made here in Dubai about trebling renewable energy output by 2030. Great. But making a commitment is only action in theory. It's not yet action in practice. So what needs to happen right now to speed this whole thing up? Adair, can I go to you first?
Well, let me take a global perspective on that. Overall, we anticipate that the tripling of renewable capacity by 2030 probably will be met. But if anything, we should be going for a higher figure, and it won't necessarily. When we run the figures for how much of that we expect to be solar, the rate of solar installation across the world is in line with where it needs to be to meet that target. The rate of wind installation is not, however, in line with where it needs to be to make that target. And the other thing is, of the things that are contributing to that target, China is huge and other countries are not fast enough. So, if you think about the different countries of the world, there are different challenges. Once you get beyond the global target, they become local. In Indonesia, they need to be able to face down some of the coal interest, which has been deliberately discouraging the development of solar, which Indonesia has almost limitless amounts of. And they need to unleash that with mandates and targets to drive that development. India probably will just about meet Premier Modi's 500 gigawatts by 2030 target, but maybe not. And they have to continue to drive the auction regime that they have, including, by the way, India is a real innovator in a type of auction called a round-the-clock auction, where you have to contract to deliver electricity 80% of all of the hours in the year by putting together within the contract a combination of solar plus wind plus batteries. And frankly, they need to ramp that up to a much higher level. But what I would particularly focus on is, at the global level, is sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa truly is sitting on an extraordinary opportunity never to build a fossil fuel as the core of the electricity system. It may still want enough thermal dispatchable plant to provide that last 10% or so, but even that is not certain in a country where the fundamental challenge is not a Scottish challenge, but is a diurnal, day to night challenge. It's how to keep the air conditioners or the fans going at night away from the solar. In those countries, sub-Saharan Africa and lower income countries, the single most important thing is finance. Finance, because the trade-off between building gas in Africa and building renewables comes down hugely to the cost of capital, right? Because renewables have the economic structure that all the cost is up front, and then you enjoy your electricity at a zero marginal cost, the cost of capital has a huge influence. If the cost of capital is very low, or reasonably low, or even at the level we enjoy in the West, they will build huge amounts of renewables. If it's somewhat higher, they'll build gas turbines. If it's where it is at the moment, they'll primarily just build diesel gensets. and run their electricity on diesel. So we have to, and you mentioned it, the MDB reform is absolutely fundamental. We have got to unleash huge flows of reasonable cost of capital into Africa and other lower income countries to enable them to play their part in this global tripling of capacity objective which has been set by COP28.
And look, just to slightly take a more parochial view, if I may, but to maybe build on a theme. I guess my frustration, if I'm allowed to say that, is sometimes... So we invest on the back of policy. Policy provides the demand for the assets and infrastructure that we build. The point you made in an earlier answer, Adair, that whatever the UK, Europe, the US builds goes to other countries who can take that technology as well and also build out is an important one. I guess my frustration has been that occasionally perhaps policymakers have been concerned about the odd pound or two rather than the strategic context and solution that's at the end of it. There is a bunch of stuff that my company and frankly the UK would have built if we had had a bit more of a strategic approach and not worried too much about the last pound or the last penny. And you made a point earlier, Giles, about risk and about the consequence maybe of not moving renewables a bit faster, being that we were, sorry, maybe Ed made it actually, maybe slightly kind of vulnerable to global gas markets, etc. That is undoubtedly true. I don't think risk costs are necessarily appreciated by policymakers when they're thinking about setting frameworks that allow us to unlock some of the new, more risky technologies. Ultimately, companies have to make a return. They have to be able to invest and make a return to shareholders. That's what allows us to keep bringing more and more capital into the markets. But a strategic vision of policies is very important to all of this.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to move to industrial policy now because it's definitely very fashionable, I suppose. I'm old enough to remember when our energy debates were just dominated by this idea of a trilemma, that we need to decarbonise affordably and to secure supplies, whereas now we want to bring about industrial policy, industrial growth as well. So my questions are to Ed, then Giles, okay? So can we actually do this country by country? Surely, can everybody be a winner with an industrial policy that delivers a cable manufacturer and a turbine manufacturer on your doorstep? Is that possible? And if so, how?
I mean, look, so in a way, the debate about the Inflation Reduction Act has sort of prompted this question, and I think a lot of the commentary on the Inflation Reduction Act has been terribly misplaced, because look, the truth is that I think the IEA says that we need something like $5 trillion a year of investment from between 2030 and 2050 if we're going to make this transition. The idea that it's all going to go to America because of the Inflation Reduction Act is frankly nonsense. Look, I think about this from the point of view of the UK, Rachel, as you would understand. We're not going to be able to compete in everything, but we have some natural advantages, notably the North Sea, and therefore things like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, offshore wind, where we actually have a leadership role already, are obvious areas where we can do well. What does government need to do? And then I'll say one thing about cooperation. First of all, it's got to have a clear sense of mission, and a clear sense that mission will be carried through consistently. I met a former Prime Minister recently, who was the Mayor of London, and he said to me, you know, I was talking about this 24 gigawatt nuclear target. I said, what was your evidence base? I said, the CCC says 10 gigawatts. He said to me, oh, did they say that? I didn't know that. And I thought, that's not a great situation when the guy who set the target had no idea about what his own advisor was. Now, he's an outlier. But anyway, you get the sort of general sense, you know, mission and consistency of mission is crucial. Secondly, a focus as part of that on breaking down the barriers. Skills, supply chains, grid, planning. I see as a constituency MP lots of renewables projects hitting the buffers or facing difficulties, and often it is the most prosaic things, but nobody, you know, the people don't have anyone to call, the delays are terrible, the capacity in the local authorities isn't there, so breaking down the barriers. Thirdly, this notion, which I think is insufficiently understood, that public investment, and I think Martin was alluding to this, public investment can crowd in, not crowd out private investment. The old notion was if the public sector invests, there'll be less private investment. I think IRA is showing that is wrong. if you try and do everything through the state, of course that's not going to work. But if you invest in our ports, if you co-invest with the private sector, if you invest in if you de-risk some of the technologies by taking a leading edge investment, you can break down the barriers that exist. So there's sort of three things that I think are crucial and what we will do to take advantage of the opportunities that there are. Last thing I would say is this, which I think is clear in your question. I think there is a huge amount more potential for cooperation across countries on this, on supply chains. If you take Britain, on the North Sea, we are part of something called the North Sea Energy Group, I think it's called. We can do a lot more, and we will want to do a lot more if we're in government, working across countries, pooling our resources, and also exporting to each other on something like offshore wind. We have the potential to be a real, massive exporter by the late 2020s if we get this right.
Europe today has 250 different factories making components for wind turbines, onshore and offshore. Every country has something, even countries that don't have any wind farms. In the UK, you're making blades, building a factory on Teesside to make foundations. The blades for offshore turbines are made in the UK, Denmark, and France. And we'll start making them in Italy soon. Only 4 countries. It's spread out. Not every country is making every component, and the industry is being very strategic about this. There are only 3 turbine manufacturers for offshore wind turbines in Europe: Siemens, Vestas, and GE. And they're not stupid. And they don't duplicate, and they're working actively with governments on this. You're absolutely right, Ed, the infrastructure support is crucial, especially when it comes to ports, also road infrastructure. And when it comes to offshore wind, we mustn't forget the installation vessels. We don't have enough of them in Europe today. It's a major bottleneck. These special jack-up vessels that can only be used for making offshore wind farms. So invest in all of that. Investment support, CapEx support, maybe OpEx support as well, investment tax credits. You can be very creative, and every country in Europe is now being very creative on this. Gone are the days when the competition authorities in DG Competition would intervene and say, no, you can't do that. The EU is transformed. It's taking a very corporatist approach, an interventionist approach to industrial policy, and that must be the policy of the next UK government.
So that's very hopeful. Adair, did you have a word to say on that? You look like...
I just want to take a slight area of maybe disagreement with Giles on the issue of ownership and that McEwen development. My own belief, and I'm going to declare an interest. I am on the board of Envision ASC, which runs our only major British electricity company, a battery company, battery factory, which is next to the Sunderland plant in northeast England, next to the Nissan plant. We are actually a Japanese company with a board which has an American, an Argentinian, a Dutch, and me, but we are 70% owned by an extraordinary Chinese entrepreneur. But on the whole, I don't think ownership matters. I think if you are dependent on Russia for your supply of gas, you are hugely energy insecure because they can cut it off. I think if you are dependent on China to buy your solar PV panels, you're less dependent because even if they cut it off, you've still got the solar PV panels that you bought already. And I think if you've got a Chinese company that owns a solar PV panel factory in Europe, you're not dependent at all. I mean, let's just take this issue of security. In the 1930s in Britain, you could have worried yourself crazy that one of our best electronic companies was Siemens. And if you were in Nazi Germany, you could have worried yourself crazy that one of the major manufacturers of automotive equipment was Opel, owned by General Motors. What happened in September 2039 was that the Siemens plants in the UK were expropriated, and that the Siemens engineers and machinery served the British war effort, and that the Opel plants in Germany were expropriated, and that these apparently American-owned assets served the German war effort. When it comes down to security of supply, I fundamentally don't think that ownership matters. I think location matters. It's a big debate, Giles, but I wouldn't oppose that. And I think in one area, I would strongly say we in Europe should be encouraging some of the Chinese electricity vehicle manufacturers to build in Europe, because we are about to face a crisis. The European automotive manufacturers have concentrated almost entirely on making electric vehicles for the elite at high price. We have got commitments to phase out internal combustion engine sales by 2030, you will be back to, and 2035 in the rest of Europe. And over the next 5 years, we are going to hit an absolute crisis of people saying, where's the £15,000 electric vehicle that the ordinary people need? I would strongly encourage BYD to set up a factory in UK to produce what they are producing in China, which is those £15,000 EVs. So I do have a bit of a difference there, Giles, though note I have an interest as well.
So I'm half tempted to keep the heated debate going, but actually
No,
I think what we'll do is we'll come back to it for the audience questions at the end. So if anyone else has an opinion on that, you're very welcome to share it in a second. But I actually do want to talk about social dependencies or social interdependencies. And I suppose that the point is that my question is about the humans, and we're all using the phrase, it's used over and over again, that we need to take people with us. And so this question is to Adair and Ed. What does a strategy for taking the people with us look like? And can we look forward to as much creativity and innovation in public policy in relation to skills, communities and consumers as we do in electricity market reforms and market mechanisms? Adair,
well,
you
let me
first.
switch from a global focus to a UK focus and describe what I think is going to be one of the biggest challenges that Ed and the Labour government would face, which is the decarbonisation of residential heat. Things that happen in the electricity system are a bit hidden from the ordinary people, right? They don't need to let somebody into their home to install stuff. And broadly speaking, the economic effect of it, you know, if we get it right, could be favourable. When we get to residential heat, 20 million people are going to have to pay or be subsidised for 10 to 15,000 quid a year for some combination of insulation or heat pumps. And they're going to want a trusted supply chain. And we are going to have to think very carefully about the distributional aspects of this. I think about these distributional aspects in thinking about the population in maybe three groups. A sort of top-end group, which I'm certainly in, and I've just bought a heat pump, which has enough cash in the bank or easily available to put a heat pump in, where frankly I think there should be some sticks, right, to do with taxation or council taxes or stamp duty if I don't put that in. I think you have a big swathe of the middle of the British population where innovative combinations of private and public finance should be saying to anybody who has a mortgage, if you're currently below an 80% loan-to-value ratio, here's 10 or 15,000 quid, which is available at a low price, and maybe there's a combination of government issuing a guarantee or working with the major banks to make sure that people can lend money, borrow money at 2 or 3% to get that done. And then I think there's a bottom end of the income distribution where we are just going to have to subsidise. There will have to be straight grants. But we need to think that totality through, and we also need to think through how are we going to get the supply chain in place of the plumbers and the electricians and the insulators required to do it. I have very successfully just put a heat pump 9 months ago into my country cottage in Hampshire. It's fantastic. The idea that you have to insulate your house to the limit is massively overstated. It works beautifully. But I was 15 months after the quote saying, when are you going to start the work? Because the supply chain cannot deliver. And Ed, as you know, I've spoken to you about this. One of your biggest challenges is how do you develop that supply chain rapidly, and how do you make sure that it's beginning to get in place before you hit a large subsidy flow? Because if you just put a large subsidy flow up front before you've done that, all you'll do is make a small number of people pretty rich.
I mean, Adair spoke very well on this. Look, I have a sort of simple way of thinking about this, which is where green is faster, where green is cheaper, go faster. and where green has upfront costs, share them fairly. And I think if you do that, we will take people with us. And if you don't do that, you won't take people with you, because people will say, well, hang on a minute, I'm in favour of this, but we're in a cost of living crisis. If you're going to say I'm going to go from a £2,000 boiler to an £8,000 heat pump and you're not going to help me, and I'm middle or low income, I'm not going to come with you. And, in the end, that is the point. And that's why, we have the Green Prosperity Plan ramping up to £28 billion a year in the second half of the Parliament. Part of the point of that is to make sure that you share the costs collectively. We know it makes economic sense to do that. We know that if we delay, we store up much bigger costs for later. The OBR says that. I think Adair sort of puts it very well in terms of the kind of groups that we need to help. Certainly the lowest income people. We need to find a solution for middle income people too, and we are working on this. Funnily enough, I was just talking to the Irish minister. They're facing similar challenges. I think they're doing quite well actually on rolling out insulation from what they've been saying. They're also sort of in the foothills on heat pumps. And I just lastly, I take incredibly seriously what Adair says about this skills issue. We have a piece of work going on that we're aware of outside the Labour Party on just a very simple question which government can't answer at the moment, which is what are the green skills needs of the country in the coming years? Who's going to need to be upskilled or change their skills? What are the new jobs we're going to need to fill? And how are we going to meet that? Now, that seems to me to be a pretty basic set of questions that government should be able to answer. I'm hoping we'll be able to answer it by day one if there's a Labour government.
Great, thank you. Now, what I would like to do is to come to our audience, and I'm wondering if one of the SSE people can take this to hand it round. No,
I don't think we should make Alistair do it, really. DIY.
Take as many questions as we can, actually. So, and I'm going to try and remember and take notes as well. So, do you want to go first?
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I wanted to ask about, tug a bit more on the cybersecurity aspect of all of this, because I work in the shipping industry and I think about our ships that collect a lot of data. And I know, as you mentioned with offshore wind, there is that national security concern. So wanted to ask, also with the EVs, I know, I agree, the location versus ownership debate was really interesting to me, because I know that there's been allegations that Chinese electric vehicles collect data, perhaps in Europe. So just want to ask, how does that trade-off weigh into this decision making? Like, should we be thinking and centralizing cybersecurity more into the conversation? Thank you.
Can I suggest that we do groups just now? What was your name? Sorry.
Jacob.
Hi, Jacob. Laura, did you have a question? So who's? Yeah, great.
Hello, my name's Erin. I'm from Arup. Ed, you mentioned the opportunities to work more closely with other nations, and I'm just wondering whether grid interconnectivity beyond North Sea would be of interest. I mean, is Labour thinking about connecting with parts of North Africa? I mean, we've got other types of generation potential in this area.
And one more question, friend from Lancashire?
Hi, yes, thank you. Miranda from East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce. So glad you mentioned skills and grid, and it's really important that we're not just tied to heat pumps, but actually other heating methods that are better for certain households. But how do we solve the problem of finance being a barrier to getting green technologies into the global south? How can we actually get around that financial problem and start to see the technologies supported by the more developed nations to reach the global south, solve the problem for all of us?
Okay, I'm really hoping that you're going to self-organise into the answers to these questions, but can I suggest that, Martin, you answer the question on cybersecurity, grid interconnections, probably Giles and Adair, and then the heat pumps, Ed. But Ed, you can answer anything you want as well.
So quickly on cybersecurity, because I'm no cybersecurity expert, and I can see colleagues from SSE horrified that I'm actually answering something on cybersecurity in the room. But I can give it a bash if you like.
Someone's going to stage an intervention.
So thank you, Rachel. That's 1-1 for the day. The truth is, of course, when we're building big projects, we're thinking a whole bunch of things. Cybersecurity is a growing issue that will be part of any project design. But ultimately, it's not a barrier to us building projects. We are going to continue to follow the policy, get our capex away, and try and work the technology. But of course, OEMs are very cognizant of the issue you raise, and we work very closely with them. And as a company, we'll be spending materially more on cybersecurity than we were even a couple of years ago.
Yes, on the interconnectors, I think this is very important. Not just more interconnectors up to Scandinavia to tap into the Scandinavian hydro resources across back into France, so that we're balancing French nuclear, etc. But the long distance ones, I think, are very interesting. Many of you will know there's a project called X-Links to build a lot of wind and solar and batteries in Morocco, and to run a 3,800 kilometre high voltage DC line, both to the UK and then up the Channel and over to Germany. I think these are very interesting ideas, and I think they are going to play a significant role in the long term across the world. I think there are people in India thinking about running lines from Gujarat over to Oman to make sure that, as it were, 4 hours after the sun has gone down in India, you can still tap into that. There are also ideas to take solar and wind power from Western Australia all the way to Singapore. And the economics do work, because Singapore is entirely at the moment producing, a lot of it is LNG based, and that is much more expensive, and it's just so cheap to make wind and solar in Western Australia. So I think this is going to be, and should be, a significant part of our long-term system.
So I'm much better on interconnectors and markets, so that's what I was hoping Rachel would give me. But one very quick point. So we referenced the energy crisis. What happened during the energy crisis was absolutely amazing, where countries with interconnection pipelines suddenly found a way of sharing and mitigating risk collectively. So you can do that on gas. You can't yet do it on power. And our traders, the first thing they will do when they get in the morning is they will look at, of course, the wind speed forecast in the UK, but also what is it like in Denmark, what is it like in other parts of the world. They then look at French nuclear availability, they then look at what's going on in Germany. The whole point is we're all interconnected. The better we can spread some of that risk, the better for the markets.
Interconnectors are crucially important. They are win-win, and unlike hydrogen molecules which move slowly, the electrons go in a whiz. Curiously, since the 23rd of June 2016, the UK has almost doubled its volume of interconnectors to other countries around Europe, and there are many more still on their way. And National Grid Ventures are doing a fantastic job on this. Other countries around Europe want UK electricity. They want to be able to sell to the UK. One challenge you will have, Ed, is that the UK and EU have still not agreed the post-Brexit electricity trading arrangements. That may still be in your inbox.
I'll answer the interconnectors and then the question on the developing world. I mean, this interconnector issue is really, really interesting, because it makes the whole baseload, in inverted commas, question much more debatable, shall we say. But talking to the Danes earlier on today, they believe that they can get to 100% clean power, and intermittency won't be an issue, because they have sufficient range of different renewable sources that they are confident that even when they have a Dunkelflaute, the word that Adair taught me, they can, which means not very much wind, that they can still meet their electricity and energy needs. So I think there is a really interesting, it's a really interesting question, and I'm interested in X-Links as well. I mean, just two answers to the question about developing countries, and I'll try and be brief. We said we'll have a clean power alliance of countries that are accelerating their clean power electricity plans. I think it's really important to have this in your mind, that unlike sort of the restriction of oil and gas production, having a club of countries going further and faster on renewables will drive down the cost for others, including the developing world. But also, as Adair said, this only works if you make the cost of capital reasonable for developing countries. Kingsmill Bond has done this work, saying that for 90% of the world, new renewables are cheaper now than new fossil fuels, but that's only with a reasonable cost of capital.
Okay, brilliant. We can take one more round of questions. Gentlemen there.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Prugg, Managing Director of Policy at the We Mean Business Coalition. So we co-host this pavilion. It's wonderful to have such a high-quality panel here in the pavilion. Thank you very much. Covered an extraordinary amount of ground. I said one question, this interesting debate on the ownership of foreign-owned production plants and what it means. Going up the supply chain one level to the critical minerals that are behind a lot of these technologies, what can or should we be doing more from a European, UK perspective to secure those supply chains, given that the minerals are where they are, and what can be done in that regard?
Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, Smith Mordack from the UK Green Building Council. Thank you for bringing up buildings, obviously a really important part of the energy transition. And I was just wondering, Ed, in terms of your plans around using planning and sort of plan making, not just development control, but also building regulations and financing schemes in order to make sure that buildings can be active participants in the grid and not just kind of passive users of energy.
What do you think is the key to that?
Well, I mean, we've got... Oh, great.
I'm sure they have a report.
We do have a report. I mean, I think there are several things in terms of, obviously, the retrofit scheme that you've spoken about already, and having a national retrofit scheme that allows us to insulate buildings but also allow solar panels to be installed on as many buildings as possible where that makes sense, batteries to be there, also community energy schemes to allow energy to be managed at a neighbourhood scale, ensure that the wealth can sort of stay within those local communities as well, but then also things like a stamp duty kind of rebate to renovate scheme to actually allow people at those kind of hinge points in order to allow them to retrofit. That will help that kind of middle income lot as well. But we've got tons of policy ideas that you can just have.
We love the Green Building Council.
They're great.
Right, can I suggest that we just stick with those two questions and that we get the Green Building Council on the panel next time and come along, that would be great. So what I'm going to do is there's two questions there. One is on critical minerals and the other is obviously on retrofit. So I'll basically come down. I will come to Ed last, but Giles, do you want to go first, then Adair, then Martin?
The critical raw materials are where they are, and they are in many different countries. Just happens that there's one very large country with a determined centralised communist government that's gone further in exploiting them than the others. They're in Turkey. Turkey wants to start mining. Chinese, Australians, Brazilians, all of these governments are talking to the European Union, about how they can export their minerals, extract them and export them to Europe for the industries that need them.
Technological innovation, recycling and full life cycle carbon analysis, I think, are absolutely crucial. Technological innovation is extraordinarily powerful. 5 years ago, in the battery business, most people were most worried about the supply of cobalt because they thought there was going to be a shortage of cobalt, and they were worried about reputational risk, child labour, bad pollution in Democratic Republic of Congo. The cobalt price today is about the lowest it has ever been because our forecasts of how much cobalt we will need in 2030 have come down about 60 or 70% in the last 5 years because we went out and designed batteries that don't require any cobalt. So technological innovation, hugely important. Recycling. We can't recycle battery materials in great volume today because we don't have great volumes. But by the time we get to the early 2030s and 35s, we should be recycling every bit of battery a material, and it makes a big difference. The amount of primary material of lithium, of nickel, of manganese that we will have to take out of the ground will be much less if we assure that there is full recycling of batteries. Some of that will occur economically in any case. Broadly speaking, the nickel and where you have cobalt are sufficiently valuable that you'll recycle an NMC cathode yourself. On what's called lithium ferrous phosphate, LFP, you wouldn't naturally do that yourself. There should be regulation that forces every single battery company in the world to do it. And third, carbon traceability. I believe we should have a cooperative relationship with China on many aspects. I don't think we should throw away their extraordinary power of innovation and the low cost that they're providing. But we should, and I say this absolutely clearly when I'm in China, we should be enforcing carbon cycle requirements on them. We should be saying we will only have solar panels allowed in bids in Europe at some stage if they meet a minimum carbon cycle requirement to make sure that, for instance, the polysilicon is being made with solar panels back in China, not with coal-fired power stations. Crucial one in this respect is what is going on in Indonesia. Huge expansion of Indonesian nickel capacity, most of it at the moment powered by coal-fired power stations and with significant local environmental impact. So we have got to start getting full traceability for these supply chains and doing full life cycle analysis and enforcing high standards. As long as we do things like that, there are plenty of minerals and they are actually spread out in quite a lot of different countries across the world. When you look at it fundamentally, it's less of a challenge when you first think, but there are specific problems we've got to overcome.
To take a slightly different angle, I mean, European supply chains in particular need to be encouraged to procure supplies. To do that, they've got to believe there is a long-term demand for what they're actually trying to do. And that demand has got to be properly remunerated, or remunerating the risk they take as well as their expertise. And that's perhaps been a little bit of the issue in Europe over the last couple of years, where our supply chains probably haven't been remunerated enough to be able to do that. So that's going to be critical going forward.
Let me answer the Green Building Council, and I can answer more generally as well. It's simple to say and hard to deliver, but there needs to be a plan. I mean, if ever there was a place where there wasn't a plan, and we've had a series of false starts and screw-ups, it's in the whole area of home retrofit, heat pumps, and the transition in the household sector. Adair is absolutely right. It's a massive challenge for buildings and homes. I'm very sympathetic to what you say, both about the use of solar panels and thinking about sort of integrated solutions for households. And I think it's really important to say, just because I think it's kind of very relevant, that we need to design this plan. This is something we're going about in advance of hopefully getting into government, so that we both decarbonise and tackle fuel poverty at the same time. Because the truth is, we've spent however many tens of billions on trying to help people through the energy crisis. You know, if we had properly insulated our homes, if we'd had solar panels on roofs, we'd have saved an awful lot of money, taxpayers' money, quite apart from people having better lives and not being deep in fuel poverty. But then this sort of takes me to my... Oh, and by the way, very sympathetic on community energy. GB Energy will play a role on what we call local power plan, with grants and loans for local communities. If you know about the Lawrence Western turbine, tallest onshore wind turbine in the UK, and owned by the local community. But I mean, just more generally, Rachel, I just want to really thank SSE and We Mean Business for hosting this panel area, etc. I mean, you know, we think there is a massive opportunity to work with business, with civil society, with people on this panel, experts like Adair, to get this right. And you know, genuinely be a mission for the country, and a mission that really galvanises people.
Thank you very much. So I said at the beginning that success would be judged on my timekeeping. We've not done too badly, but to be honest, I think that success should be judged on the quality of the contributions from our four panellists and for your engagement as a lovely audience. So I just need to say one final very big thank you to our guests, Ed Miliband, Adair Turner, Giles Dixon and Martin Pibworth, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.